Okay, let's begin. Good evening to all of you who are watching us in here or behind the screens. I'm very happy, actually, that we have a chance to have this conversation with Quigley Cryan Brockbank from Manchester, also UNESCO City of Literature, and Quigley has been spending nearly 2 months in residency in Tartu by now. So first, maybe start, I would ask your impressions. How has the residency been for you? And
It's been lovely. It's been really, really nice. It's been so nice to see, because I've never been to Estonia before, to really spend enough time here to properly get a look at it, I think. I think Tartu is probably somewhere, because it's obviously not especially big, that you could quite easily come here for a weekend and not see very much of it, but staying here for ages has meant that I can properly, I don't know, see why it's such a beloved place. It's been very beautiful.
have you had some, managed to get some writing done as well?
Yeah, I actually came here planning on doing a bunch of short stories, because like I have a short story collection out, and I was hoping to do work on my second one. And I started a short story when I came here, and I've just kind of got stuck writing it this whole time. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and more things keep happening. So I guess I kind of mostly, hopefully, through what will be like a much bigger kind of novel maybe than I originally intended.
So it all begins with a short story and then turns out to be something else.
Yeah, it's now just a very big story, I guess. But I've never really written anything that long before, so it's been really cool to just try a completely different type of writing and have the time to actually do it naturally, instead of being like, right, I'm going to sit down and write this. It's just like, oh, this just kind of keeps going.
That's great.
Move over.
Really looking forward to reading it one day when it's like a
Yes.
5-volume novel.
Yes.
But you did start writing with short stories, or when did you start writing? I think I haven't asked you that.
I wrote a lot as a kid, and then I kind of stopped as a teenager and didn't pick it up again for a long time, because I just thought my writing wasn't very good. And then over lockdown, I was unemployed and living with my parents, and was just so bored, like applying for jobs and getting nowhere, that I was like, I just need to do something. And I kind of started writing without any plans to do anything with it, just kind of more short stories. And a lot of my short stories from that time period are much more about like, I need to move out. But yeah, I kind of found that I really enjoyed it, and I've kind of not stopped since. And yeah, it's been really fun to rediscover something that I loved so much when I was younger.
Indeed, and so your writing career has been pretty swift, I would say. Like
Yeah,
very few years, you've published a collection of short stories, a play.
yeah. The play has only recently been fully finished, but hopefully some more will come of that at some point. Um, yeah, I guess I've just gotten really back into it and be like, I actually love doing this. I want to do this more. And I've been working on a lot more since.
And you mentioned that in the beginning you wrote stories about like wanting to get out of the apartment. I kind of, when you said that, I kind of felt that some kind of feeling of it can be felt in some of your stories I have read,
Yes.
like this, I don't know, being in some kind of closed
Yeah, yeah.
state, or yeah, maybe not even space, but in a closed emotional state.
I think quite a few of them, when I read my own stories, I'm like, well, this is just really obviously about like that annoying thing that happened to me this time or something. But like, obviously, everyone reads them with different interpretations, because they don't know exactly what's already happened to me in my life specifically. But yeah, I think a lot of the stories that are in here are ones that I wrote a while ago, so they're more similar to that kind of time period. And one that I planned on reading this evening was, if I read it, I very much read it as, I need to move out. I need to get a job, but perhaps that's my own interpretation.
Yes, I think it might be that the readers perceive it on a quite different level, because what I noticed reading your stories and hearing some of those who you read at the Crazy Tartu Festival, I noticed that quite many of them are told in the first person narrative,
Yeah.
but it has kind of weird effect on the reader, because it, in a way, there is quite a lot of like transformations and bodily things that might be even feel intimidating at first. But I think the fact that it's told in the first person perspective also, in a really paradox way, gives it some kind of distance. You know what I mean? I mean, maybe like at the same time it brings closer to the reader, but at the same time you can feel somehow as if the narrator isn't telling about themselves.
Right. Yes.
So it's a strange effect, but maybe that's only me.
No, that's interesting. That's a good point. It is. They're very unreliable narrators, all of them. I wouldn't trust any of them to tell you the exact truth. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point.
Yeah, but in general, as I already mentioned, there are these transformations and very bodily things, and I think the most general characterizing sentence being used, I think, by yourself about your work is like, how was it? Mixing body horror and folklore elements with absurd humor.
Yeah.
And so, is that kind of something, these motifs and themes that you developed when you already started writing in the early age, or how did you like become a body writer?
That's a good question too. I think what I wrote when I was much younger, when I was like a kid, was probably a lot more pretentious, because I read a lot of like old books and wanted to speak like someone from the 1800s. So a lot of my writing was like, and then there was an ogre, and we all said forsooth, and this kind of thing. Like, it was not realistic, and it's like when I've come back into it, I've been trying to, I guess, remove some of that and get less bogged down in the speech and more in terms of just expressing an emotion. Like, I often feel like when I sit down and write a short story, and I think this is why I write short stories most naturally, I generally am just in a mood or feeling something, and then I'll just kind of sit down and for a while, and then by the end of it, I'm like, right, I feel a lot better now, and then all of that's been kind of stuck and crystallized in this story on the screen. It's very cathartic. But I think that when I then read over that story again, I'm like, right, well, I was clearly feeling this emotion, and it kind of is a way of bringing it back. And I guess the kind of body horror elements fit into that mostly because a good way of expressing feeling, or like making someone feel a feeling, is to imagine it as a physical thing rather than like saying, I'm feeling sad. It's like, I'm feeling this inside me, and then people reading it will go, oh, I know what that's like, or whatever. Yeah, I think I never expressly sat down and thought, I'm going to write some hot body horror today, and it was much more like, I'll just kind of see what happens. And it kept turning out to be about physical expressions of emotion. And this is why the collection is body horror focused, but other ones have more kind of different focuses. So I'm hoping to expand my practice maybe.
Yes, but I think it's like an interesting set of motives, because it's not something we have seen, at least in such form, in Estonian literature, for example. There are some authors, some works where you can detect a similarity of some motives, but not, let's say, not in that intense concentration, maybe. And also, what seems to me about those stories where the this body horror motives have a very explicit place or descriptions. It also at the same time seems kind of like again in a way cool. There's no like the narrator doesn't bring much emotion into it. It's not very dramatic. It's kind of told with certain distance or certain coolness.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't intended that, but like I think often we don't really understand our own emotions especially well. I think if we try and describe them to somebody else, we will only ever describe this limited portion of them. And I guess it's kind of like, I think in a lot of these stories, it's about your body is doing something and you have no control over that, you know, and it's expressing your emotions for you. Like there's quite the well-known book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is about like how trauma affects the body and stuff. But I think on just like a basic level, if you're not admitting that you feel something, but your hands are going like this, you know, it's still very much in you. And I guess the collection is kind of mostly about people for whom they're like, you know, I'm feeling this thing actually, and then their hands are going like this, but like in various different forms. Although, I mean, as I say, I never intended to write body horror. It's funny that I don't think of it as an explicit thing because I think of it just as, and then this thing happened to me. You know, for me, it was just, I was feeling this that day, and I sat down and wrote for a while. And I remember reading one of them to an audience and people going, this is just about my day. Like, I'm really confused why people are reacting so strongly to something that for me is just like, and then I did that. But it was about me cutting my ear off or whatever. Yeah. So
Yeah, I guess actually, well, the reason I've been like bringing up this body horror phrase is that this has been used to describe their writing, but at the same time, I myself, when I was reading your book, I also felt that there's not much horror in it, actually.
Interesting.
It's rather like observation.
Okay.
Maybe like, as you said, it's these descriptions come from emotions. But at the same time, it feels like they also help to like look at those emotions from a distance somehow, at least for the reader.
That is cool. I've not heard that before. I think horror is a weird genre in the sense that it encompasses a lot of things that are essentially feeling bad. Like if you feel bad but you're not crying, it's counted as horror in general. So like I think a lot of the feelings expressed in this are less kind of fear and more uncomfortableness or a feeling of kind of haunting or something lingering that you can't quite deal with. And I think, yeah, it's maybe not specifically horror in a conventional sense. Like it's not David Cronenberg and, you know, like limbs exploding and things.
So yeah, like it's not you're not like scared or like shocked. It's like a flow of things happening, and okay, this is weird, but but at the same time, in addition to like emotions, I feel there's also like there are also more abstract themes, like there are religious motives.
Yeah.
So in the title itself, godly.
Yeah.
So is this something you do consciously, like think about the relationship between religion and emotions, or?
It's really not. It's something that it just kind of sneaks out. Like I don't intend to think about it especially, but I do find it very interesting as a topic. Like as someone who was, I went to Catholic school, but like England's not a very Catholic country, and it's not an especially religious country, but it still kind of has the hangovers of, you know, Christian morality and ideas in a big way. And I am really intrigued by the kind of the way that like religion that's left interacts with people who might not realize that they're thinking in religious ways and things like that. Yeah, like just, I mean, like for example, I don't particularly identify as Catholic, but I do recognize ways that growing up in a Catholic environment influences ways that I think, and I have to go, oh, that's a very Catholic thing to say. You know, like sometimes, you know, it's good to feel bad and like suffering is a holy thing and this kind of thing. And you have to go, actually, no, it's that's just not true. That's not necessarily a helpful thing. And yeah, I find it very fascinating. And as I say, I don't intend to write about it specifically, but I do think it comes out a lot in my writing, perhaps because it's something that I don't think about consciously, if that makes sense. Like it's the bits around the outskirts that I'm most interested in.
Yeah, I understand. It's something that's you like carry along with you somewhere in your luggage.
It's kind of something that's grown around the outside of your perception, and it's still there, but you maybe don't see it on purpose very clearly.
How about folklore? You do have also Irish background, and
Yeah.
well,
My mum's
and-
Irish.
So yeah, we all in Estonia know quite a lot about Irish folk tales and rich heritage. So is that something that's been with you since the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I remember being a kid and just loving to hear stories about like the salmon knowledge and stuff. And it's like, wow, there's a fish that holds all this knowledge. If I could just catch him, this kind of thing. But it's interesting because England is not a country that particularly identifies as having folklore. And like, I know that it does, and different areas will have more and less, but it's not somewhere where most people would say, like, they would know anything about folklore in general from where they come from. It's a place I think that feels quite divorced from kind of cultural roots in a big way, probably because of a lot of factors like the Industrial Revolution. Anyway, but I think that that's kind of interesting too, is like religion has kind of died out, but it's still there, and folklore has kind of died out, but it's still kind of there too. It's just maybe changed, and we don't think of it as specifically that in the same way. Like Irish, like when Irish culture is still very proud of its folklore, it still very much identifies with it, but it remains a kind of static vision of what we used to talk about, like what used to be the stories that we said when we were, you know, before the influx of all these different people. And I find England's lack of folklore almost more interesting because it's building on something it doesn't know about. It's more modern and changing and unreal in a way.
Yeah, but what about writers? I mean, I've had these glimpses from here and there, or it's feeling that somehow younger generations of writers are getting more into folklore as a source of inspiration.
It's getting bigger, I think. And like, I mean, I think that's probably partly to do with like movies like Midsummer and stuff that foreground it, and horror getting more interested in folklore and roots like that. Like I've run an event in Manchester a few times called Feast, which is a folklore and horror evening, and that always, you know, gets a decent crowd because people seem to be really looking for this stuff and wanting to see it. But there aren't maybe as many opportunities. I think it is so interesting because it is something that people are kind of getting more into now and creating more of. I couldn't tell you why specifically. Maybe we're all just looking for kind of a basis of like community, and like this is what used to bind us together, and now we're all feeling a bit isolated and going, maybe I can get back into this. Maybe I'll find a community by getting back into stories about fish that can know things. You know?
So in a way, going back to the roots, or even reinventing the roots by mixing them together with some other components.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a fun way also to just kind of change. Like, it's writing fiction that's realistic can be quite limiting, and there's obviously different forms of making it unrealistic, but I think folklore is a really fun way to do that that kind of works with established traditions that can make something really interesting and creative.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, well, in Estonian literature, I guess folklore has been more present all the
Yes.
time.
Yeah.
But there have been like waves of rediscovery or also waves of like inventing new ways how to write our folklore
Right.
heritage into like, new fiction and so on. And I think something interesting is currently happening also elsewhere in the world on that level. But coming back to before we hear some of your stories, coming back to what you said about your writing as a child, that you used to like try to write in a kind of 18th century style and so
Yeah.
on. Did you also read a lot of 18th century literature? What do you read now, or what inspires you?
I actually still really like 18th century literature, and I kind of feel like I shouldn't because I should read more contemporary stuff. But I really like it. There's something about big houses and, lots of huge clothes and mysterious servants and things. I think it's so fun. Um, yeah, I try and read a range of things. So I've been trying to read more contemporary literature so I can actually have more of an idea of, the current scene, as well as from different cultures, because I think it's very easy to just get stuck in English and American books, if you're, especially if you're in England. That's like the main things that you hear about. So I've been trying to read more books outside that. But like I've been reading Elizabeth Bowen recently, who is an 18th century, no, 19th century, 20th century writer, early 1900s. So, I kind of been varying a bit. But I've read some very good books from the 60s recently.
So it's kind of reading is kind of a mixture of very different things.
Yeah, it's a bit at random. Like my partner has a big spreadsheet of everything that he reads, and he'll research something before he buys it. Like if he's going to buy a book, he'll Google it and he'll read the reviews and he'll see. And I tend to be a bit like, oh, that's a nice cover, and buy it in the bookshop and just kind of see what it's like, which is not always a good method. But I've got some very interesting books. It does mean that I have quite an eclectic, maybe, range of books.
And there's also no like specific genre. Do you read more short stories now that you write short stories yourself?
I have been reading more of them since I started writing them, actually. And sometimes I'll read them and be like, oh, I should have written that. That's great. I should definitely write like this. And then I can't. Like I've been reading Elizabeth Bowen's short stories, and they're incredibly beautiful, very small moments that are not very important in people's lives. Like it'll be like an hour where someone loses a parrot and then they find it again. And it's just like, this is unimportant. It's not really that serious, but it's just, it feels momentous for the person. And when you're reading it, it's so like, wow, this is such a huge moment, even though it's not actually going to have any repercussions in the rest of their life. And it has made me kind of go, maybe I should write more kind of slice of life things. But I also just get really influenced whenever I read anything that's good to go, this is great, I should read more, or I should write like this all the time, which is not always possible.
Well, I guess you can't write everything.
Yeah, I want to do everything.
But I really love that in the acknowledgements of your book, you, among others, thank all the people who create, how was it, small or little weird things to perform them or to be read and so. And I guess your stories also fall into that context, at least in a way. So maybe let's hear some of these really weird things.
I've read a lot of them at events, and it is the kind of thing, like an open mic night, and they're usually for poetry, and it is the kind of nice thing to hear other people reading weird stuff at poetry events where you're kind of like, oh, you're like me, you've also written something strange. Yeah, the first one I thought I'd read is quite short, and it's one that I wrote very early on. It's called A Fungus on the Face of God. There are roots growing out of the bottom of your feet. Long, thin white hairs trail deep underground. I've always felt them, but they're so fine they're hard to see. Shifting strands that slide through the earth unnoticed. They're like nerves to me. I flinch each time they meet each other, feel each impulse travel through them. I'm like a tooth. I feel other people's too, grazing mine as we pass. Sometimes I am sure we have become entangled, and the nerves of theirs have been felt as the nerves of mine. The pain of this is almost unbearable. I don't know where they lead, but I like to picture the convergence as a heaving mass of matted roots, breathing somewhere in the core of the earth. Or perhaps they're more fungus, letting us leak their spores for them as roaming, fruiting bodies. I used to find the thought comforting, the earth holding us to her, leashed as wanton children. It's harder to hate the others too when you feel their roots near you, when you know them to be but your brother fungus growing on the face of God. Lately, though, I'm not so sure about the roots. They've been pulling at me. It's becoming harder to lift each foot. Each landed step sinks deeper into the ground. The mud begins to creep between each toe, and now it's at my ankles. I'm wading all the time. I'm afraid to be pulled down, for I cannot breathe the dirt. I made the decision a little while ago, and now I sit upon the ground with a small bone knife in hand. I have tried to cut the roots before, but they will not be severed. So I sit, breathing in and out, deliberating, waiting for resolve, but I know it will not come unless I trick myself, so without thinking I begin to cut the flesh from me. What shocks me is it doesn't hurt. My blood is so loud within me I cannot feel, and I watch my hands begin to cut the sole from my first foot, and the roots blacken and wither as I am, in part, released. Halfway untethered, my body swings upwards. My hands hold the knife to my next foot. My gut twists as the knife enters and more roots begin to die, and with each ruined nerve the earth needs me less, but I cannot stop. I will not be pulled down into her. The heel, the arch, the ball, each toe is shorn of flesh, the raw redness open to the air, puckered with empty root holes. As the knife nears the last sad fibre, I am hanging almost completely upwards from the earth. The root screams as it tries to hold me alone, but I end it, pushing the knife through and clear, and I grasp at the ground to hold myself still to the earth, but the grasp my fingers clutch is weak and rips apart under my weight. Then I am falling, falling into the gaping blue mouth that is the sky.
Well, I think this story actually represents very well what you said about what we talked about, like roots, and also like this expression of emotions through
Yes.
physical elements, let's say.
Yeah, kind of visualizing physically what things feel like, I guess. Also, it's me saying, I need to move out of my parents' house.
Oh, that's the moving out of
Yeah. Yeah, but perhaps a strange way of describing that. Will I move on to the next?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to have to find these on my phone, so there might be a slide delay. Okay. This next one's a longer one, and I think this is what I submitted to here to come. It's called The Dancing Bears of O'Connell Street. From time to time, a man would walk down O'Connell Street with a troop of dancing bears. Now, this was not in itself unusual. Many travellers passed through my small town, and it was common enough practice for them to stop and rest a while, or draw a few coppers from an audience long held captive by boredom and curiosity. And they could not have bestowed their crafts upon a more grateful populace. As humble people, desperate for news of anyone or anything outside our own walls, we gawped and thrilled at the sight of contraptions or creatures hitherto unknown. We were addicts of novelty. And the travelling men knew it. You could see it on them when we crowded round them, hands out offering whatever pennies we had to live off for a sight of whatever they could bring us. And they loved us too. Our adoration fed them more than our donations. Some would be beaming out of the energy of the intensity, the love of the crowd, while others would maintain a distance, and you'd feel the smugness of them. You knew they were looking at us like we were naive little mud people, fascinated by what should rightly bore us. Dancing bears, too, were not uncommon. An older form of entertainment typically favoured by the kids who pulled the legs off insects, and by adults who were not ashamed to beat their own dogs in the street. Soon enough, though, the sight of the bears, the sheer size and power of them, would crack us all, and we'd come running to watch them whipped and bellowing, that flame alit inside us with the horror and delight that made the little men with the cages so much money. But this man was not like the others. He was tall and thin with a long black hat, and when he first walked through our gates, the children screamed that a man had come who could walk with the bears. And indeed, the monsters were not caged or beaten or bloodied. They were not chained or starved. The great beasts, in full bloom of health, simply walked behind this great figure in a neat and quiet line. Their strange procession was followed through town by a horde of stunned children, pushing each other closer and closer into the paths of the bears, and screaming or laughing when they went unnoticed by the very beasts their parents spoke of in hushed and frightened tones. The adults, too, leaving their work and calling to each other, joined the crowd, hypnotized by the spectacle, and together this great mass reached and filled the town square where the tall man in the hat had come to a stop. He turned and looked round at the crowd with smiling eyes, while his bears took their places behind him. The man took off his hat and placed it upon the ground. Then he turned once more towards the bears. He nodded, and they began to dance. In shuffling, awkward fashion, the great creatures reared onto hind legs and tottered around and between each other in choreographed patterns. The man played no music, and no sound echoed across the square save the soft and rhythmic scraping of huge claws upon the stone ground beneath us. Now I cannot tell you why, but something in the sight of those bears made me feel sick. I could stand and holler out with the others when the bears before us were battered and fighting, the man with the stick against the bear with the teeth. I was rooting for the man alongside the others. But these were not animals. Their movements were clumsy and pathetic. I felt ashamed of them, and they could not look at us. Not once in their horrible dance did a single one look up from the ground into the eyes of the crowd. They could not meet our silent, watching faces. The sight of it all sickened me, and as the dance went on, I noticed that there were tears in my mouth. My face was wet with them, and my shoulders had been jerking all this time with silent sobs. I missed the shouting, angry figures of the old ringmasters, and looked with hatred upon the back of this new traveller. And when the man nodded once more, and the dance abruptly ceased, it was he who finally looked back at us, smiling out from behind his own bright blue eyes. The crowd began to move then, pouring forth to throw coppers in his hat, or shake his hand, or vie to be the one he chose to lodge with, the one on whom he turned his gaze. Some grinned and slapped his back too, greasy-haired young men and doting mothers, not the usual fans of dancing bears. They congratulated him on his talents, how he used his mind, his wits to subdue the beast. But I noticed others of the congregation leaving with red-rubbed eyes, shooting the man uneasy glances, or looking to the bears sat motionless, now unnoticed by their master. The ringmaster met us all with the same smiling face. I left anyway to go back to work. I chatted with the others and made cups of tea, and gossiped, but something from the sight of that horrible dance remained with me, suspended just behind my vision, hovering round the edges of my mind at all times. I noticed others too among us, whose faces darkened when conversation turned to the man who walked with bears, and praise was laid at the feet of this new humane approach. And then, when I awoke that night to the taste of tears in my mouth once more, I knew that I had dreamed about the bears. I lay there in the darkness of my room and felt the sickness of it all, its empty horrors sit upon my body, weighing me down. It was long before sunrise, and looking from my window to the moonlit streets, I felt my body begin to move. It crept from my bed then, and from my room, and out of my door, and somehow I knew where it was going. I knew it in myself, though I could not work the parts of me that knew how to feel afraid. I remember still, as in a vivid dream, the knowing of my own bare feet upon that earthen path, the warmth of it, the soft yielding of the clay. The night was still and humid, the moon a stain upon deep blue cloth. It was only when I reached the door of the stable that I came all at once back into myself. I could smell the hay then, and the dirt, and the warm furry bodies breathing softly behind the wooden wall. Still somehow compelled, I lifted the latch and opened the door. Inside the stable the bears lay sleeping, their mountainous forms gently rising and sleeping in the dark rising and falling in the darkness. Even in sleep, I noticed that they seemed somehow clenched, their mouths pulled into tight lines, nullified. I knelt beside the great body of a beast and reached my hand out towards it when a sound behind me made me turn. The ringmaster was standing by the door. He wore no hat, and for the first time I realized how short he really was. A thin little man with cropped hair, but something in the way he smiled down upon me made me feel as though he towered. I noticed then that he did not smile with his mouth. It remained a harsh line, but it was his eyes that made you feel like he was smiling at you. And I suddenly got the intense impression that he was looking out at me from somewhere far behind them, that the bright blue eyes he wore did not quite touch him. I thought you might try and find me, he said in a tone I could not quite place, not angry or surprised as I'd expected, but as if I'd let him down in some way, as if I was exposing something in myself by being there. Horribly aware of my body before his gaze, I retracted the arm still hanging pathetically, half reached out. I was worried about the bears. Were you? He said it flatly, no intonation, nothing given away, and yet the statement of it made me feel like he didn't believe me. No, really, I trailed off, forgetting my own words. He stood there unchanged, still eyes smiling, and I felt my body swell in the darkness, big and ugly and awkward, filling the silence of the room. They looked sad. It sounded so limp. He said nothing, and I knew I'd given the wrong answer. I had outed myself as foolish and a child, a naive villager from a nowhere town. They're beautiful, though, I offered. The bears, the dance, it was haunting. His mouth flickered at this, and I thought maybe I was close. Maybe if I could speak the right combination of words or act the right way somehow, maybe he would let me go. He would look at me and know I had potential. He would see in me something that could touch the man behind his eyes. They must really love you to dance like that. I could feel it. I could feel that I was close to touching him. Something in me was alive with the closeness. It was like each hair on my body was screaming, standing on end. I could get him. I'm sorry for sneaking in here. I just had to tell you. His eyes narrowed, and I felt his disappointment in my chest. My heart growing, beating hard, I poured out more words, blurring together, louder and louder. I would get him. I could find the right one to reach him. I'm sorry. You were right. It was beautiful. It was really beautiful. Please let me make it up to you. He shifted his stance, and all at once I fell silent. I waited for him to speak. I knew that I was close now. I knew it. If I could just make him talk, if I could offer him something. And as I desperately thought of what I could say or do to reach him, he nodded just once, gently in the darkness, and he smiled as I began to dance.
Thank you. Listening to this story and also thinking about the one you read during Crazy Tartu Festival, the longer one.
Yeah.
It seems like while in a lot of stories, like things just happen to the person narrating it, in some stories there is this somebody else, this other,
Yeah.
this quite mysterious other, as in the story and also in the other one.
That's true.
It's kind of have you thought about it yourself, or how do you feel if we talk about like things happening as sometimes metaphors of emotions?
Yeah.
So where is the which moments are those where there is somebody else controlling them?
I hadn't actually thought about them as wholes. I guess all of them kind of make sense in my head of what I was feeling when I was writing them at the time. But I hadn't thought about, and some of them where there is another person. I guess it revolves around this fear of being caught. You're doing something wrong and you don't know what you're doing. And what do you do in these situations? I don't know. I guess it's a very childlike fear. It's like this very deep, innate thing of, I'm not sure why that's something that I have written about multiple times. But
I think it's for me, it's a feeling that most people can understand and have experienced. And then, that I guess also that's why usually these others seem very abstract. That you can't name it, what they are actually.
I think if you were to actually get to know the other person, you'd probably be like, well, I'm not scared of them now. You know, it's the fear of someone who has some degree of authority, but when you're an adult person, people generally don't have a degree of authority over you, so you kind of, it doesn't need to be as scary. Yeah, that's an interesting angle. I read this open mic thing, and somebody in the audience came up to me afterwards and was like, I've taken detailed notes on what I think all of the metaphor of that was. And it was so sweet. It was really nice. Because I kind of, when I write something, I try not to look at it too much, or I'll get bogged down in like, what if people read it as being about this instead of about that? So I tend to analyze stuff anyway. I analyze literature in general. So I have to not analyze my own stuff. But it's very nice to see somebody else's take on it and what it might possibly mean.
Well, I mean, in a way, I guess it's also not your task to analyze your own
Yes,
writing, but
very
just write
true.
it.
Very true. I can do the writing.
Maybe somebody else wants to ask something.
Where does this awareness come from?
I'm not sure. I think partly when I started going to therapy, a lot of that focused on feeling things in a physical sense, because often it's really easy to go like, oh, what if this happens and this happens and this happens? And then what you actually need to do is go, oh, I'm just feeling a bit anxious and it's all fine. And then once you realize that, it's like, oh, this wasn't the big thing that I was really thinking about for 2 hours or something. And I think it's partly to do with that. But I think it's partly also, I think images and physical feelings are much harder to write about, but I think they're much more evocative. And when if I were to try and write, I think where it was just focusing on emotions, I think it often doesn't hit you as much as if you describe it in a physical sense. Like, I think that's probably why I've looked into it more, is because I connect more with the image of the feeling and the image of the bodily response. I mean, I often really think that we arbitrarily divide feeling and like physical and mental stuff. I think it's all the same. It's just different kind of ways of looking at the same thing. But I think this is one that makes the most impact on me personally when I read it, and makes the most sense when I write it too. Thanks.
Maybe one more story?
Yeah, this is just a short little one. It's one I wrote for David Hartley, who was the previous resident from Manchester here, and he did the Embassy of Utopia. So this was my submission for that, and it's called A Vision of the Future. Corinne was about 13 years old, she remembers, when she first started becoming a person. Not all at once, of course, but in dribs and drabs, a moment would appear real to her, the space around her solidify briefly, and she'd know that she had come a little further into being. She would record these moments internally and completely, what the light looked like, the way her head was facing, the movements around her, and she hoped in time to reach a full set that she could access at any moment. As years passed and this aim appeared more and more futile, she still retained this habit. When a moment felt significant in some way, or beautiful, or offered a glimpse into some reality in which things were good and she was loved utterly and completely, she would freeze it in this manner in her mind. She liked to think of herself as preserving it in amber, and would often picture the slow encroaching tide moving like warm honey to embalm herself in her entirety and the bodies of those around her. Faces would remain beautiful and smiling, voices warm, loving, kind, in a way that made irrelevant any future transgressions. She liked amber most because it could not shatter, and because when, over time, she had collected a whole gallery of remembrances, she could still enter the glowing orb of each, moving slowly through the thickness of the drowned but living past. When alone, and bold enough to envision a pleasant future. She would picture a life formed not of droplets, but a through-running line, gold as the sun, each moment blended with every other, all worthy of preservation. When she was fully ready, she knew the world would the world would not be a mounded heap of instants, but one long tide of meaning that flowed ever onwards. Beauty would simply continue. She would feel everything and fully comprehend it as she could not now, and fully appreciate it as she still felt that she failed at, so that she did not have to walk back endlessly through closed seconds to root around for something warm to bask in. Her whole life would be warm. Her whole world would feel loved. That, she thought to herself, that is my vision of the future. Now that she is 35, Corinne has not noticed that she is a person in some time. Currently, she is washing dishes. Later, she will do something else. At the moment, it is June, but sometimes in her life, it is February. And throughout her days, air moves around her, and sometimes it rains, and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, thank you, and I think it's also a beautiful note with which to end this evening and maybe have more reason to feel as a person.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I thought I'd end on a more positive one.
Thank you, Quigley.
Thanks very much.